tradition of just war theory, that account of just cause and jus ad bellum more generally was extremely state-centric. It focused, at least in its post-Westphalian mode, almost exclusively on the rights and responsibilities of states. So we had a conception of the state that was very much built around what, again, Michael Walzer described famously as the domestic analogy, the idea that we could think about states as having a set of rights and responsibilities that were in many ways like the rights and responsibilities of individuals, written large, expanded up onto the level of the corporate actor of the state. So just as the individual person has the right to life, the right to bodily integrity, so the state has certain rights, most notably the right to political sovereignty and the right to territorial integrity. Just as an individual person, if he's subject to unjust aggression, can have the right to kill in self-defense, so the state, when its rights to political sovereignty and territorial integrity, if they were unjustly impinged or attacked, it would have the right to kill in the course of a defensive war. But I think what complicates significantly and problematizes that picture is the fact, the very obvious fact, that states are not only unitary actors, they are actors that are made up of a large number of individual persons who are themselves the bearers of rights and obligations. So when we think about war, when we think about just cause and the justification of war, we always have to bear in mind this duality, the duality of the corporate level of the state and of the individual. We have to think very carefully about the interplay between the individual and the state. And what I think in practice that this means is that when we pose the question of when we pose the question of war in terms of liability to harm, liability to attack, which is the way that I was suggesting we pose it in the panel this morning, we need to think about that question both from the perspective of the state and from the perspective of the individual. And it's important to realize that we can have liability at either of those levels without having it at the other level. So we can have a case where individuals within another state may be liable to harm or attack, say, for example, because they're committing a crime, right? They're committing a crime of assault or aggression against other individuals within that state. So we might say those individuals are liable to be harmed and attacked, either in self-defense or punitively. But we might say that there's no right to intervene because it's another state, it's another polity that has its own political sovereignty. And the harmful action against those individuals would be improper political interference. So that would be a case where there's individual liability without state liability. It might be other cases where a state has engaged in certain kinds of wrongful action that makes us say, well, that state oughtn't to enjoy the rights of political sovereignty. But nonetheless, we might say that individual soldiers within that state's army have not done anything to make themselves liable to attack. So the case that we were talking about this morning, where we might say that there was a conspiracy at the level of the political elite of a certain state to engage in an act of aggression, but no unjust action by the soldiers, might be a case like that, right? You might say, well, the state doesn't have a right against intervention, but nonetheless, if we killed the soldiers, we would be wronging them. So this is to suggest that when we're thinking about these very basic issues of ad bellum justice and thinking about just cause, we have to constantly bear in mind these two levels of justification, the level of the state, the level of the individual. And I wrote a book a number of years ago that, if those of you who are interested in it may want to kind of follow these arguments up, to say that when we think about central just causes, even the most central just cause, which is the cause of self-defense against foreign aggression, it's extremely difficult to give an explanation for why we should have the traditional package of rights and responsibilities that we have traditionally taken states and armies to have within just war theory. I argued there that you can look at this question either in terms of what I call the reductive strategy. You could say, well, let's look at whether we can give an account of national self-defense as simply a complex exercise of fundamentally individual rights, right? So to say national self-defense is nothing but rights of individual self-defense exercised in a collective way. alternative way that you could look at it is to what I call the analogical strategy. You could say, well, let's look at states genuinely as being rights bearers analogous to individuals and see whether we can give an account of national self-defense that way. And I argued that in both of those contexts, it's very, very difficult to give a picture of a just cause of national self-defense that will give you something that we can recognize as a package of military rights that we find within traditional just war theory. Now, I think the reason why we have these problems, it seems to me, it's pretty clear, has to do with the rise of the doctrine of individual human rights. And Michael Walzer spoke about that in his lunchtime keynote address. I mean, it seems to me that the rise and universalization of the doctrine of basic human rights in the 60 years or so after the Second World War has been one of the most significant and profound developments in our collective normative experience. It's been an absolute transformation in the way that we think about ethics, and the impact on just war theory and our thinking about the use of military force, I think, is still very, very much in its infancy. But it seems clear to me that this idea, the idea that all humans everywhere have a certain package of basic rights, certain things that ought never to be done to them, unless they have themselves done something to make them liable to that, is going to have an absolutely profound and transformative effect on the way that we think about everything in just war theory, and in particular on just cause. So let me just identify what I think are going to be 4 of those very significant effects. One of them, obviously, has been to create a space for ideas about humanitarian intervention and the doctrine of responsibility to protect. If the idea of individual human rights plays this kind of foundational role that we seem to increasingly be accepting that it does, then it's clear that that opens up a space for action against sovereign entities on the basis of protection of human rights. And we're seeing that idea, although very imperfectly and very messily worked out, we're seeing that develop very, very clearly, I think, in terms of the rule of responsibility to protect, and also the way that just war theorists have dealt with these issues within just war theory. A second set of implications is something that Jeff McMahon has done an enormous amount of work on in the last decade, and I'm sure he probably will say a few words about it here today, which has been to problematize the idea, the traditional just war idea of the moral equality of combatants. Right? If we agree that basic human rights, and in particular the right to life, is a basic constraint on all action, not only in the domestic context but also in the military context, then it's very difficult to see how the traditional idea of a symmetrical and equal combatant right to kill enemy combatants can be sustained. It looks like you're going to have to draw some kind of distinction between those combatants who are liable to be killed because presumptively they're fighting in an unjust war, and those who are not. Another one, I think, is the implication that I spoke about this morning, although here I think that the consequences of thinking about human rights are much more in accordance with traditional interpretations of just war theory. And that is in the question of whether we consider preemptive or preventive military action to be appropriate. I suggested this morning that if we take seriously the idea of human rights, and that that military action can only be justifiable if it's directed against those that are liable, then that makes it very difficult to understand how preventive action, or action against soldiers who are not yet engaged in wrongful aggression but you think might be about to do so at some point in the future, it's very difficult to understand how that can be morally appropriate. Well, as I said, that is, I think, a conclusion that's much more in accordance with traditional just war principles. And the final one, I think, is the one that Professor Walzer was addressing in his lunchtime address. It seems to me that if we take seriously the idea of human rights as a constraint on military action, then it will inevitably imply that our thinking on issues like necessity and proportionality will have to be much, much more restrictive than I think we have tended to interpret those in just war thinking in the past. And I think that we can see that if you think about what we would consider to be appropriate risks and costs for civilians in an anti-terrorist action that was undertaken on our own territory, where it was our own citizens who were exposed to that collateral harm. If you think about the way that we would think about appropriate rules of engagement, appropriate risk to civilians in comparison with the way that we think about appropriate risks and harms for an action undertaken in Iraq or Afghanistan, for example. If you think about the gulf in the different ways that we think about everything from the way that we equip, think about ROE, the level of risks, there's an enormous gulf there. And it's very, very difficult to explain how that gulf can be understandable if we start from the assumption that humans everywhere have the same package of rights. So I think that this kind of broad realization, this tendency of arguments that I think have originated from this profound and seminal idea that's been in the process of working out for the last 65 or so years, this idea of basic human rights, is going to transform an enormous amount in just war theory. And it's, I think, going to have effects that are normally much, much more restrictive and constraining than we have tended to think in the past. And I just want to finish with the thought, although very schematic, but the thought that it's conceivable to me that the ultimate ending point of this series of arguments, or this kind of working through of this idea, may be to question the very purpose of having an independent category of jus ad bellum with its central idea of just cause. It seems to me, one of the questioners this morning, I think, put the idea quite well. He said, the way that we tend to think about just cause is we have a very high threshold for action, right? Very high burden for entering into that state of war, that state of collective political violence, because we understand that it has all of these awful moral effects, right? We understand that we're going to be killing intentionally or unintentionally people who oughtn't to be killed. So the idea is you have this very high threshold precisely because you recognize that there is a permission to do things within that context of war that would otherwise be utterly impermissible. But another way of dealing with these cases would be to develop a set of moral ideas that is much less discontinuous and much more a continuation of the way that we think about appropriate defensive action in the context, for example, of emergency policing. Right? So we might try to work on a conception of the ethics of law that is not radically discontinuous with the way that we think about protection, law enforcement, and defense in domestic contexts, but is, as it were, a continuation of that, and that tries to implement in a much more consistent way the way that we think about protection of civilians, risks, harm, and so forth in those domestic contexts, extended with appropriate modifications to these international contexts as well. So I think I'll leave it there and we can pick up the discussion.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker, as Professor Roden mentioned, has been doing some incredible work on just war theory over at least the past decade or so, almost like untangling certain things that have been assumed by others and really sort of subjecting it to some incredible philosophical rigor. I know personally I've benefited a great deal from his work. I'm talking about Jeff McMahon, professor of philosophy at Rutgers, author of The Ethics of Killing, Problems at the Margins of Life, and Killing in War, both published by Oxford. Apparently, he has several books forthcoming from Oxford. This seems unfair, by the way, including The Right Way to Fight and The Value of Lives. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jeff McMahon.
Thank you. Perhaps I should follow the example of an earlier speaker and say that the views that I'm going to articulate don't represent those of the U.S. government or the Navy or the Army. I think, more is the pity, but still.
Or Rutgers University.
Or Rutgers University, for that matter. Yeah, I'm on my own in this. A moral justification.